Alright guys, so this is going to be a video on how to win at chess when you are playing with the black pieces. A lot of beginners I think are a lot more comfortable starting as white, and that makes sense because white gets the first move in every game, so you get to decide whether it's going to be an e4 game or a d4 game or some other kind of opening. So white always starts with the initiative. White makes the first move, black makes their first move, and then white kind of just has that slight lead. And black's goal in chess, first goal, is to try and neutralize white's lead in the game. So what I'm going to do, I played a game against a Dutch player who's rated between 800 and 900, so a beginner kind of level, definitely in the lower half of the world of chess. The middle rating for rapid on chess.com is about 1050. Okay, so this isn't a video to criticize white's play, but I want to show you and give you some ideas about what you should be doing as black and how you should be thinking when you're playing as black. So in this game, white starts with one e4, moving the king's pawn forward 2. And this makes a lot of sense. It's an extremely popular starting move and by far the most popular move for at all levels, I think, but certainly for beginners. So with this move, white is doing a few things. First of all, so whereas this pawn previously was covering these two squares, that's d3 and f3, moving the pawn forward now, these two squares are still covered. Okay, they're still covered. That one's covered by a pawn and a bishop, and this one is covered by a pawn and a queen and a knight. Okay, so the e-pawn wasn't required in the defense of these squares or the protection of these squares, but now it's the pawn is covering the squares d5 and f5. So what that means is that black can't really put one of his pieces onto those squares because the pawn can capture it. Okay, so in this game I'm playing as black and I respond with d5. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm trying to take the initiative away from white to a degree. The most common response at top levels is c5 on move 1. That's the Sicilian defense, where black tries to gain some control of the middle, but from the flanks, and then push his other pawns up later. There's also, but e5 is very, very common at beginner levels. But with e5, one of the issues there is that you can get into, there's all kinds of different ways to respond. So you've got, for example, the knight's gain, the knight comes out, and then very often, because that knight's then attacking this pawn, you could have knight to c3, and then from that position you've got the two knights game where the knight comes out, you've got the Italian game where the bishop comes out to there, you've got the Spanish where the bishop comes out to there, or you've got the Scotch. And so black, if black plays e5, he's going to have to know how to respond to quite an array of different moves. So sometimes it's quite nice to be able to say, I'm going to take control of this game to a degree, and I'm going to play something that maybe you didn't expect. So hence d5, and this is known as the Scandinavian defense. I've played it quite a lot as I've been building my knowledge of chess. It's okay. It's not a spectacular opening for black, but it does give you a little bit of that element of surprise. So in this case, I think white makes a bit of an error by bringing his knight out to c3. And the reason that this is an error, I think, is because it invites black to push d4, and now this knight is under attack. So what's going to happen to white's initiative? White now has to use a move to move this knight, and let's look at all the places where the knight can go. Obviously moving the knight back to b1 will simply hand the control of the game over to black. Black could then play e5 and have 2 pawns in the centre, whereas white's only got 1 pawn in the centre. So that would be awful. Bringing the knight back to e2 is not great. Yes, it kind of attacks the pawn, but the pawn's already defended by its queen. But knight to e2 blocks off this bishop from getting out into the board and blocks off this queen from getting out into the board. So that's not great. So you've got knight to a4. It can't go to a2 because there's a pawn there. Knight to a4 again isn't brilliant. Knights on the rim are dim, and it's going to be open up to more threats. So, for example, bishop to d7 could hit the knight there. So what my opponent played in this game was knight to d5, and this is risky because what we need to do now again is review which of these squares can this where can this knight move, right? It can't move here because of the pawn. It can't move here because of the pawn. It can't move there because of this 2 pawns on there. It can't move to here because the queen will take it. It can't move to there because of queen, bishop and knight could take it. Can't move there because there's 2 pawns attacking that, right? So the only 2 squares he's got are these. And if black plays e5 now, then suddenly this square is no longer free. But what about this square? Okay, again, no longer free. This is a very, very common trap that either side can fall into, right? So it comes from here, and if the central pawn advances and hits the knight jumps behind the pawn, it is liable to get trapped. White actually realised this, knows it can do nothing about it. Now the pawn comes out. Okay, so the c pawn, moving the c pawn 1 square forward is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, it's a very, very different story to moving your f pawn 1 square forward. When you move your c pawn, that allows your queen to come out into the board, gives the queen now 2 nice diagonals to enter the game and get into the board at some point. However, if you move your f pawn forwards, this diagonal here is not healthy because it's actually pointing towards your king. Your king doesn't want to come out into the board. Your king wants to hide and get safe and be protected. Okay, so the f pawn, the forget about it pawn, is a very different proposition to moving c3 now, or c6 if you're black. So the other thing that this move does is it puts your pawn in front of this king's diagonal, right, blocking it off and covering this square from pieces who might want to go onto it, and it's nicely defended by a pawn and a knight. So I'm attacking white's knight with my pawn. It's not the ideal thing to make 3 pawn moves at the start of a game of chess. It's actually much better in general, all other things being equal. You really want to be getting your minor pieces out into the board. There's your bishops and your knights. However, in this instance, I've got the opportunity to win a piece, and it's like move 4 of the game. So the queen comes out, and the queen is now exerting a pin, right? Because the queen is pointing at the king, this pawn cannot move. It cannot legally move. It cannot go forwards because it would open up the diagonal and put its own king in check, and you're not allowed to do that. And likewise, it can't capture the knight, same reason. So white needs to respond, and there's a relatively simple solution to this. You break the pin by interposing another piece onto that diagonal between the king and the queen. So now this pawn can do whatever it wants. Well, it can't move sideways or jump around, but it can go ahead and capture this knight, which is still in danger. Now, if white had taken his time and thought about this, he would have realised that there is now an escape for the knight. He could have moved the knight back to b4, because the b4 square, although it is under attack by this bishop, it's now defended by the queen. So he would have been alright. But, you know, he's a beginning player, didn't realise that, and instead moves his queen out of the way and the knight falls. Now c-pawn takes on d5, and this is good. It's good to, if you have the opportunity to capture inwards towards the centre of the board rather than outwards. You want to control the centre as much as possible, because the centre squares are the most useful squares. You can control more of the board from these squares. You can access more of the board from these squares. Okay, so now we have a situation where white's missing their f-pawn, but has a nice couple of pawns in the centre of the board. Black is, sorry, not the f-pawn, the c-pawn. So both c-pawns are now off the board. White has his queen out in the board, which is not great, not ideal. And obviously white has lost a knight. So white now needs to get his minor pieces out into the board, and so does black. So on the next turn, I bring out my knight on the king side. In general, it makes a little bit more sense to develop these two, your king's bishop and your king's knight, rather than your queen's bishop and your queen's knight. Okay, and the reason is because in 2 moves, develop the knight, let's say develop the bishop. Now I've created the opportunity to castle. Okay, so only 2 moves are required to shift those pieces out of the way so that the king and the rook can see each other, and then they can castle, provided neither has already moved and that the king doesn't pass through check, or isn't in check, or doesn't end up in check. So so far so good. So now all black needs to do is develop the bishop and try and castle the king. White now plays a decent move, knight to f3, similarly developing his king's knight, which is good, and generally also think about bringing out your knights before you bring out your bishops. Okay. The other thing this move is doing is it's hitting this undefended pawn on e5. There is no piece defending that pawn right now. So now what black needs to do is defend the pawn. The pawn can't move. It's blocked in front. It can't move forwards, and pawns can only move forwards or capture on a diagonal. So what you need to do here is think about, how can I defend that pawn while progressing my development, right? And there are a couple of options really. One option could be to bring the knight out to one of these squares, which would in theory defend that square, but that's not possible right now because there's a bishop on here and this square is under attack by that pawn. Another option might be to bring the bishop out to d6. Another option could be queen to e7 to defend this pawn, and potentially to bring this knight out to g4 in defense of the pawn, but that would be a very poor idea because this pawn just comes up with an attack, kicks the knight back, and then this knight would jump in and grab the pawn. Okay, so in the game, obviously I want to play bishop to d6. It does a few things. It defends the pawn, it develops my bishop, and it clears the space for my king to castle. Okay, so I'm doing what I have to do and developing at the same time. Always a good idea. Now bishop comes out to c4, which is maybe not the ideal square for this bishop because it's looking kind of down at where my king's going to be, but there's a pawn in the way. So I don't think that's excellent. This pawn is also already defended by a pawn. This pawn, however, is only defended by the queen, and that queen may want to move and go and do something else. So I'd have suggested maybe bishop to d3 might have been slightly preferable, but anyway. So now what I do is I kick the bishop. So these pawns now, because I've already decided I'm going to be castling that side of the board, okay? It's a lot safer. My pawns are still all at home, and where they are providing a shield for my king and also in turn being protected by my king. These pawns, however, they've lost the c-pawn, so you could say that they're maybe a bit more expendable. But so I've got ideas of maybe pushing these pawns here and stopping this bishop really from being able to get into the game. The pawn is obviously protected by the bishop on d7, so I can just push it forward to there. And now what's happened is that white has lost what we call a tempo. Tempo means it's Italian for time, and it means that white has essentially wasted a turn. Because, let's say, come back to here, right? Black has just moved. Now it's white's turn. White has the initiative, white has the control. White gets to decide what happens next in this chess game, right? Now with this move, okay, white has made his move. But now, black develops a pawn, which is defended, okay? And now white moves again. And that maybe doesn't seem like such a big deal, but now it's black's turn. White has had to put his bishop back where he didn't want to put it in the first place, but maybe should have put it in the first place. Right? He moved it to a square where it could be kicked away. Black developed a pawn, so this pawn now is controlling these two squares. It might get defended by the A pawn at some point. Okay, it's removed a square, a potential square from that bishop, and now it's black's turn to go. Black now has the talking stick. Black now has the initiative in the game. So black now proceeds to castle. And what we've got now is we've got a situation where black has castled, so his king is much safer. He's got 3 minor pieces out into the board, and all he has to do now in order to complete development is to bring out this knight and probably take this queen off the back rank so that these two rooks can see each other to connect the rooks. Okay, so nearly complete with the opening. White, on the other hand, has to get this bishop out, and you can see that this bishop is going to have a struggle to get out into the board. Why? Because the D pawn hasn't moved. Okay, black's central pawns are nice far forward out in the board, controlling space. White's D pawn is, for one thing, it's doubled, so white has 2 pawns on the D file, but also it's still stuck there with a bishop in front of it where it can't move forward, and the B pawn likewise is still at home, so this bishop can't get out. So it's going to be at least, let's say, 1, 2, 3 moves before white can complete development. Whereas in black's case, 1, 2 moves to complete development. And that stuff matters. It does matter. Having the initiative in the game matters. It's like landing the first punch in a boxing match. You just rock your opponent back slightly, and while that's happening, you land your second punch, right? And let's see how the game progresses from the opening from there. Okay, so white goes ahead and castles. I play a6 just to reinforce this pawn, so I don't have to worry too much about it. That means that this bishop here is free to go around and cause trouble elsewhere. Right? You don't want your pieces too often tied down in a defensive role, because you want them to go out and attack your opponent. And now look, this bishop now moves again. So this bishop has made 1, 2, 3 moves. Okay? And that matters, and the reason it matters is because this bishop has made no moves. So this bishop is still stuck there, plugging up the back rank of white's position. So these rooks are, I mean, this rook here is technically an undefended piece. Okay? So you want to connect your rooks. You want your rooks to be able to see each other on the same rank or the same file, so that they are protecting each other. Okay? And that's why it matters. This bishop making 1, 2, 3 moves means that there are at least 2 moves that white could have used in order to develop his pieces, and that he hasn't used. Okay, so now attacks can start. Right, so bishop comes in, just generally attacking this knight. That means if this bishop should ever move again, which knowing its habits is quite likely, then if this bishop was to capture the knight, the only way for white to recapture would be with his G pawn, and that would expose the king. It would leave the king a little bit vulnerable. So what white does now is he uses another move to move a pawn, but this is not an ideal move because it's moving one of his edge pawns, and it's doing nothing to develop this final minor piece or to connect his rooks. And this is not a problem for black. So black simply moves the bishop back to h5. And this puts the question to white now. Is white going to push g4? Use yet another pawn move and, crucially, open up more space around his king. So no, white decides not to do that, which I think is probably sensible, and instead centralizes a rook. Now, centralizing rooks is a good thing, particularly when there have been exchanges in the middle of the board and the central two files, these ones, E and D, or D and E, could be maybe semi-open, which means there's only pawns of one colour on the file. At this point in the game, we've got this kind of gridlock in the middle, which means that this rook is maybe not going to have much action soon in the game. We're going to have to resolve some of this stuff going on. And notice that these pawns can't capture each other. There's no captures there. And likewise for black, right? So we do have a state of gridlock. Additionally, centralizing your rooks when it is a good idea, I might consider doing that. Rook to e8 and maybe bring this rook to d8 at some point, but more likely c8, where we have a completely open file. It does make sense to move your rooks, but generally you want to do that after you've finished developing all of your minor pieces. Rooks and queens are counted as major pieces in chess. Now, so moving this rook, yes, it makes sense, but it's probably not the right time to do that. Okay, so now the bishop comes back to g6. And yes, this bishop has moved a few times now, 1, 2, 3 moves. However, so what we say is, there are these general principles, and you should stick to these principles unless there's a really good reason not to. And in this case, there's a really good reason not to stick to the principle of don't move your developed pieces too many times until you've completed development, right? So yes, I've still got a knight on the back rank, but this knight hasn't really got much to do. It could maybe come out to here at some point, but it's lacking in opportunities at this point in time. So I don't need to maybe worry too much. And as you can see, I've got the initiative in this game as black. Now, the reason why I moved this bishop back from h5 to g6 is tactical. There is a tactic now on the board. And what we have is a situation that I call overwhelm. Okay? There's a piece on the board that is now has more attackers than defenders. And it's the pawn here on e4. Pawn on e4 is attacked by my knight and my bishop. Okay? And it's defended only by the queen. So on the next turn, if it were my turn next, which it isn't, I could capture the pawn with either of these pieces, and the queen really cannot recapture because the queen would then be taken. So one of the things you have to be aware of, one of the most fundamental and most basic tactics in chess, is spotting pieces that are either undefended, right, or under-defended, and that pawn is under-defended. Let's see what white does on the next turn. Pushes g4. Why? Right? That might have made sense when the bishop was here on h5, kicking the bishop back, but not really, because it's not... In fact, moving the bishop from that square to that square is better for the bishop. Right? This bishop is now defending both of those important pawns in front of the king, and in turn, it's defended by both of those important pawns as well. So, this is a poor move. Okay? So, what does black do now? Bishop takes e4. Right? And bishop takes e4 is attacking the queen. Right? Knight takes e4 would have been a decent move as well, but bishop takes e4 comes with initiative. Right? Comes with tempo. What this means is that whatever white's plans were, he's got to spend his next move getting rid of that queen. That queen is going to have to move. And there aren't really that many squares that the queen can go to. Can't go to here because of the queen, there because of the bishop, there because of the knight, there because of the bishop, there because of the pawn, or there because of the pawn. Okay? Can't go there, or can't capture the bishop because the knight will take. That means that the queen has only got two options to move to. Right? So white is now having to do something that white probably didn't want to do or intend to do. What's more, Black now has 2 pawns in the middle against white's 1 pawn in the middle. Right, so it's a matter of gaining initiative, doing the moves that will give you the slight advantage over your opponent, and those advantages can compound as the game goes on. So let's see how it finishes. Bishop comes in, grabs the other pawn, because it's still defended by the knight. Right, that knight was addressing both of those squares, and guess what? It's hit the queen again. Queen has to move again. Right, this is how you win at chess, guys. Now pawn e5 to e4. Boom. This is called a fork. This is a pawn fork. Right, whenever there are pieces that are 2 squares apart on the same rank, and a pawn can move and attack them both, one of those pieces is likely to fall. Okay. Black now attempts a counter attack, but this is clearly a blunder, right? Which means a very bad move that results in a significant loss of advantage in the game, because his queen's under attack, right? You can't counter attack a knight when your queen is under threat. So pawn takes queen, bishop takes pawn, because when the pawn takes the queen, obviously the pawn is now attacking the bishop too. Bishop takes pawn, and now bishop takes knight, because if pawn takes knight, we've got queen recaptures, and that just improves the position of my queen. Pawn takes, queen takes, and now black is in a completely overwhelming situation. White pushes a pawn to h4, queen captures, too little too late, and the queen dives into h1, and that's checkmate, because the king has no legal squares to go to. Can't move where his pawn is, can't go there because he's still in check, can't go there because he's in check twice, can't capture the queen because it's defended by the rook, and can't go there because the queen and this bishop are both attacking that square. Okay, so that's it. That's how you win a chess game playing with the black pieces. Okay, so I've shared a lot of very, very useful tips, I think, here for beginners particularly. Really concentrating on the opening. Don't be sloppy in your opening. Those opening moves matter. Okay, and other than that, get your pieces out into the board, control the board, look for tactics. Tactics win games, right? But keeping the initiative. If you can gain the upper hand over white at the start of the game, then that initiative could compound move after move after move. And you've seen how many times in this game white was essentially forced to play moves that he didn't want to play. He was forced to play moves that didn't improve his position, that didn't progress his campaign. Okay, and that's simply all it is. At every level of chess, that's what it comes down to. It's the same basic things: control of the board, initiative, all of that. Okay, so I hope this has been useful for you. See you next time.